Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. I recently read a really good book. Here's what it's about. While rising CO2 levels have created the climate crisis, global warming, and the environmental crisis that will shape our species' future, the long story of industrial decisions that led to our existential predicament, as well as the willful disregard of the consequences of rising CO2 levels by government and business perpetrated through a trail of lies and misinformation, is the history lesson that everyone needs to know. However, most books about the climate crisis stay serious, which makes them seriously challenging to read. Our guest today, David Lipsky, tells the tale with surprising insights and even some laugh out loud humor through a modernist collection of compact chapters that will keep you turning the pages of his book, The Parrot and the Igloo: Climate and the Science of Denial. Even though the climate story is gloomy, the book is an entertaining and often infuriating read that starts out with the electrification of communication and human life by Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. He then weaves the threads of scientific alarms raised throughout the second half of the 20th century, along with briefings about many of the liars, spin doctors, and industrial lackeys who have carried the water that drowned out every effort to curtail CO2 emissions, into a really compelling read. David Lipsky teaches at New York University and is a National Magazine Award winner who turned his attention to climate denial out of frustration with the lack of visibility into the sources and tactics of misinformation about our warming planet. You'll enjoy The Parrot and the Igloo and likely want to see some of its villains imprisoned when you're done. You can find The Parrot and the Igloo and all of David Lipsky's other books at Amazon, Howell's Books, and your local bookstore. We'll get to the conversation right after this quick commercial break. Welcome to the show, David. How are you doing today?
Mitch, it's great to be here. Thank you. I'm well. How are you?
Well,
Hot.
doing
It's
fantastic.
hot. It's an early summer yet again. No surprise.
Well, heat dome time, and
Yeah.
we're the right thing to be starting off this conversation with because
Cool.
it's about the climate crisis. And I wanted to say first off, I really enjoyed your book. It was an engaging, entertaining read about a topic that most people turn into the dreariest story in history.
Thank you. I actually put a huge amount of effort into it. Seemed like we're all supposed to do what we can do, and the thing that I could do is to make this story one that you could turn to for fun. It is a thrilling story, but it tends not to be told in a thrilling way. So it
Well,
ended up doing the work itself.
you make a lot of interesting and entertaining connections in The Parrot and the Igloo, but tell us about that connection in the title. What's the significance of The Parrot and the Igloo?
There's two significances. One is a lot of the book, the second half of the book is about organize the football team of extremely professional deniers. And it's about the size of a football team, 11 people on the field, and then let's say 14 reserves. But the people in that movement, they were very frank about saying, it's amazing the effect we've had. There's only about 24 of us. There's only 2 dozen of us. But when they were working for the cigarette industry, which is the job they had before they were denying on the climate, they were at a conference and a lawyer, I think it was a lawyer from Jones Day, which is a very connected law firm in DC. He said, here's the thing we have to know about how to get people to misunderstand the cigarette story. All modern civilization has an adversarial culture, but America has the most extreme version of adversarial culture in history. So that if you have position A, instantly there'll be a position Z. And the title, The Parrot and the Igloo, is that. I think that there is, and it's a problem if you want to see things solved. The problem, anytime something anytime an issue enters the American issue sphere, the American politics sphere,
Mhm.
it's like the way protons either become negative or positive in that box experiment, and you don't know per Heisenberg whether it's going to be positive or negative until you open it. It's as if we can only have binary responses to things, basically. And I think that one of the things that we've learned as voters and just as people with the weather of politics over our head is that when we hear overstatement, we understand that it's become part of a game that involves different issues as
Yeah.
counters. And so the parrot and the igloo, the parrot is the way that progressives overstate what climate is going to do. And the Igloo is the way that conservatives understate it. So that's the secondary, that's the shadow of the title. But what the actual title means is this. And the title tells a really funny and tragic story, which is the science of global warming, as which I'm sure you know, goes back to the 1820s, then to the 1850s. It is refined in the 19th century, and it is always refined by the mainstream scientists, never outside the mainstream. The leading scientists of their nations tend to be the ones who are carrying the ball a little farther down the field. But by the 50s, it was public science in America. So such public science that Roger Revelle, who is our first great American climate scientist, again, he was from the Office of Naval Intelligence. He helped to create the Bureau of Ships during the war, and there are buildings named after him at UC Davis. Totally mainstream figure. He does some research in the 50s that suggests that everyone understood about carbon dioxide and climate change going back to the 1850s, but he understood that it'd be coming faster. And another scientist at the same, and so he warned us about that, not in JAMA or not in EOS, but not in the Journal of Applied Meteorology, but in Time magazine. Not a place to hide something like that. And the title didn't hide it either. The title was One Big Greenhouse. And the warning that Dr. Revelle gave in Time magazine was that in 50 years or so, this effect might have a violent impact on the world's climate. That same year, that's 1956, in October of that year, another great early American climate scientist, also working with the Navy, Gilbert Plass, he was talking to the Times, and the Times had it right in their weekly Science Friday section. It was called Science Week in Review then. And the Times summarized his work in October of 1956 that in the future, once this effect really kicks in, it will, for example, it will render the Arctic regions into tropical jungles with gaudy parrots squawking from the trees. So 1956, we have a head start on this. We could have begun planning for this or taking action early. I've almost gotten to the Igloo. Instead we don't take action, and it is more than half a century later. And in February, during one of the small months of 2010, after the issue has entered the issue sphere and gone through our political experience, at the end, it's like a character who's wizened and veteranized by a Picarex series of experiences in a movie, and is sitting there woozy. A conservative senator named James Inhofe, a senator from Oklahoma. There's a heavy snowfall in DC, and on the Washington Mall, he builds an igloo, and he puts two signs on it: Al Gore's house and honk if you like global warming, honk if you heart global warming. But so the story is, how did we go from a parrot to an igloo?
The politics of weather is the most divided conversation in America right now. Well, maybe there's one other one, but we won't get into that. It seems like we need advice about how to use humor in these very divided times. What's your recommendation to anybody about balancing humor with this very serious discussion about climate and the fact that we need to do something?
It's just that we actually do need humor, but the basic thing is that if people notice that when you bring this issue up to people, that it's a little bit, and the climate scientists who I talk about this, their facial expression when they talk about climate change is wry, because they are, there was a great phrase. Do you ever read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first C.S. Lewis book?
Yeah.
He had a great phrase for what's happened in Narnia since the wicked queen took over. I've forgotten her name. And his description is, it was always December, but never Christmas. And so that is how the climate scientists have felt about the promise of climate action, and then the fact that it hasn't come for 30, 40, 50 years. But for people who are not in the climate business, bring up the issue. And or watch someone talking about it on television, or watch a politician, and their face and their voice do two different things. Their face, you'll watch them doing an improv. Their face looks like someone trying to be serious. And their voice gets a certain sound, and it's a little bit like you've told them about a slightly distant relative who they forgot they're connected with, and you've told them that person is desperately ill. And so they're trying to look and sound serious. And the fact that that's the way we talk about this issue at all times, the fake seriousness, as opposed to the wry smile of the climate scientists, that is part of what's allowed us not to take action, basically.
the conversation around AI feels the same way right now too. But let's stick to the climate.
I think that's a brilliant connection, by the way.
I the things that we are currently ignoring in terms of our future peril are myriad.
No, but listen, but that was the great thing of writing on this issue.
Yeah.
It talked about a way that we matured between 1979 and 2024, which is first we understood that talk and communicating the vital data about an issue, that leads to action. And somewhere it seems around 2005, 1998, we began to accept stimulating talk about it as a substitute for action. Same exact thing is happening with AI. It's like, if we talk about it seriously, that's all we have to do. Clearly, we're being serious about it.
That there's a certain amount of magical thinking that it's just expressing it. The if we build it, they will come to their senses.
And Mitch, if magical thinking resulted in magical outcomes, that would be great. But what we seem not to have noticed as a people is that magical thinking just stops at the thinking.
Well, but that's where the book is really interesting to me, is over and over you find a person who in their actions and effort changed the direction of history, good and bad. So I wanted to ask you about a few of them. And the first is how was Thomas Edison the original tech bro, sort of an Elon Musk for the Gilded Age?
For one thing, it's interesting. We always forget about the past, and this is going to sound, first it will sound dumb, and then I hope it will sound really smart. That's always been my social. But the past doesn't know it's the past. The past thinks it's the cutting edge. So that the telegraph was an amazing bit of tech. It's the first mass communications tech, but it's thrilling. You are communicating with someone in a different state, different city, different country. One of the first conversations that Samuel Morse had with somebody in another city, and this literally is one of the first interstate conversations. He was in Baltimore covering the, I guess this would be an 1844 convention, 1842 convention, and he's talking to the operator in DC. And they're communicating the news of the convention. And then the other operator says, "What did you have for dinner?" And Morse writes, "Mutton chops and strawberry, what had you?" So that instantly, once this technology existed, it was being used the way we use Insta for talking about our meals. But the telegraph was like that. It was thrilling. So Edison, when he saw the telegraph, he did what any techie would do. He took it apart, put it back together. He would work. The job that he got was he worked as a telegraph operator. The word for that was a plug, because you then would get more time with this tremendous machinery. And then he had spent so much time around it that he began to figure out ways to put it together better. Just the way Jobs and Wozniak, looking at those Sinclair logic boards, were like, we can use this pre-existing tech and make it do things that no one has expected. So he was able to send out 4 messages over wires that before could only send 1 message. And then because that made his fortune, because he was someone who could do that when the telephone, which is using very similar technology, it is using the analog version of digital. They brought that technology to him and they said, "Hey, here's a problem. Here's why the phone is," and the phone wasn't called the phone then. This is so much like our time. It was called the speaking telegraph, right? Because it's a telegraph with voice. And they said, "Can you make this recordable? Because with telegrams, if you're doing business over the telegraph, you can look back at what the telegraph was. This is scary because there's no record." And so he tries to make it recordable, and he invents the phonograph. And then once he invents the phonograph, he's able to attract enough venture capital to create workable, small portable illuminating light bulbs, right? And then to do that, it is so much. Okay, the last part is, Jobs, I'm sorry for the long answers, but it's thrilling material. Do you remember what Jobs said about the laser printer? He said that would be the killer app for the Macintosh, that because you wanted to do laser printing, you would have to buy this machine. The killer app, what Edison wanted to sell, just like Jobs, he is a tech entrepreneur, he wants to sell electricity. And so if he creates the light bulb, the incandescent light bulb, he can actually sell the dynamos, which he has also perfected. So he is a perfect early tech bro.
Well, the interesting thing is that Edison, like many of the tech bros that we early in their career treat as gods, ran out of gas. And to a degree, because he aged out of that hacker mentality in large part. How do you see, as you look at the climate crisis, is there a hacker thinking about how to get out of this? Have you run across anybody like that? I'm curious.
No, and I think that it's interesting. I wonder if, because you and I were talking about AI earlier, and I
Mhm.
wonder if AI might prove in the same way that once Deep Blue started playing against Kasparov, it turned out that they could examine more positions and reject unacceptable ones more quickly. I wonder if AI, so Mitch, you were going to say something.
No, I was going to, so yeah, I agree that if we
Yeah,
look past the whole question of the energy use,
exactly. Yeah,
AI could help us, but the problem
yeah.
is AI is being trained on successful scientific outcomes rather than all scientific
Yeah,
effort.
funny. Yeah.
And so it's overestimating its capacity to solve problems at this
But
point.
that is not a hard thing to reprogram. For example,
Agreed.
one of the fascinating things in AI on the chess level is that there is a new chess program that is beating the established ones because it is making wildly unpredictable moves, and the other ones have all been told to play a very intelligent game,
Yeah.
not a game with swings. So I think if you change the instructions that you offer to an AI, but no, the weird thing about technology with regard to climate, and it is a dispiriting bit, but also funny. And it's useful to have that veteran wry smile of the climate scientists as opposed to the fake concerned, oh, distant relative is ill. And when will this conversation be over so I can go back to my normal voice? A friend of mine went to work for one of these senators who is most connected, most vocal about our need for solutions to climate and the need for citizens to be abstemious in various ways. And so when he went to write speeches for this person because he cared about the issue and is committed to political solutions to things. He was very surprised to learn that in his or her private life, this senator did not believe in the things that he or she was asking us to do, did not believe that abstemious behaviors were the solution to this.
Yeah.
He felt those things were useful in themselves, but the actual belief of this senator and of many other politicians is we're not going to have to change our consumption patterns. We're not going to have to change fossil fuels. There will be a gadget that will solve this problem at the last minute. So presumably everybody believes there is that hacker out there, but the
Yeah.
problem, and it's a gamble, what if there is no hacker?
Well, let me ask you about another individual who
Sure.
I think had an opportunity to change history, but didn't, and that's Jimmy
Many
Carter.
people.
He
Yeah.
put solar panels on the White House. He's considered the first environmentalist president, and yet when the oil shock happened, he pivoted to coal as
Yeah.
our answer to sustainable, independent energy. What would we be? What would the world be like if he had gone the other way and embraced renewables?
There's a fascinating thing about that. A writer whose first name I think is Franklin, but Franklin Rich wrote it was the cover story in the New York Times Magazine. You know how the New Yorker in the 50s, they loved Salinger so much that sometimes they would give the whole magazine over to the latest class family story. This story was so important to the Times Magazine about 7 years ago that it was the majority of the magazine. And what Rich said was, we had the chance to solve this from the time that Carter was president and then the 11 years after. He was talking to a man named Gus Speth, who was also involved very deeply with this issue in the late 70s. So the title that he picked for the Times Magazine entire issue, and then also for the book that came a half year or a year after, is Losing Earth, the decade when we could have solved climate change. So I think there's no clearer answer than that, except, Mitch, did you see Oppenheimer?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so Manhattan Project, right?
We
You'll
could do
see
it.
where this answer is going. So Manhattan Project helps to speed up the war and helps to end the war, gives us radar and atomic weapons. So if it's 10 years, oh, sorry, Mitch, what were you going
And
to
the
say?
modern economy.
Yeah. Tell me about the modern economy piece of that.
Well, I mean, the Manhattan Project spawned several core technologies and a group of scientists who drove a wide range of innovation. And that,
I'm laughing because that's what I was going to say. So it's
yeah,
nice meeting someone who knows the same stuff. So yes, so drove technologies as government research, government investment in science tends to. You and I and everyone listening knows how much science came out of our trying to beat the Soviets to play golf on a distant satellite or not so distant satellite. But the Manhattan Project veterans were invited back by the government in the mid-50s because
Mhm.
we were involved in a long twilight struggle. And so they said, hey, let's get the band back together. So they reformed as a group called Jason. And Jason was so secret that the name wasn't released and the meaning of the name weren't released until around the turn of our century. And Jason was doing the same kind of work for the defense community that the Manhattan Project had done during World War II. So extremely serious. Towards the middle 70s, the research of people, it's a little bit like getting a drug approved by the FDA. Gilbert Plass and Roger Revelle. Roger Revelle, of course, he becomes a professor at Harvard, and his most famous student is Al Gore. So that's one of the reasons that Gore understood how the physics of this worked much earlier than other politicians. But by the 70s, a number of different scientific organizations have been examining the research of Plass and Roger Revelle, and the reports start coming in from about the mid-70s on. National Academy of Sciences produces, I think, a 300 or a 350-page report in 77 saying, we can't go with coal. Coal is going to cause carbon dioxide warming to spin out of control. There's the World Meteorological Congress meets in Zurich, I think in the early part of 1978. And in the spring of 79, Gus Speth's organization, which is the Council on Environmental Quality, it only exists to report to the White House. He releases a report in the spring of 79 saying, this is not a faraway thing. It's going to start happening in the 90s. Government must start dealing with this problem now. And he says in the Times, he expects it to be very influential in government decision-making. Doesn't think it's an academic issue, thinks there's going to be action now. And as a side note, he was right. Once President Reagan came in a year later, he instantly tried to close down the Council on Environmental Quality. But the last report that comes in 1979 is the report from the Jasons. And the Jasons have been looking at it, and they say it's ominous, and they say it's clearly going to happen. And the chairman of that report, he also says to the Times doesn't say that it's the Jasons because you can't mention the Jasons. They just say a report that was presented through the Department of Energy. He says in the Times, this is a problem that is not in the future. We must start responding to it. I think what Speth said is that things would spin out of control unless mitigating actions were taken immediately. So the White House is obviously responsibly unnerved by all these reports coming in. And so President Carter does what a responsible leader would do. He turns to the National Academy of Sciences. National Academy of Sciences is 2,200 people at any given moment. It is the Hall of Fame, except you continue to play your sport. So if you have a problem and you are the president, you ask them to say what the likelihoods are. So he says, I need to know quickly. And can you give me a quick answer? Is this true? Is this going to happen? And on July 29th of 1979, he gets the answer back from the National Academy of Sciences. And the report, this is the key sentence in the report, the results of this brief but intense study will be reassuring to scientists, reassuring because scientists want to know that their research for 100 years at this point has been accurate, will be reassuring to scientists, but disturbing rather to policymakers. If the carbon dioxide release continues, this panel finds no reason to believe that climate changes will not result, and no reason to believe that those changes will be negligible. So there's no uncertain terms and no action is taken. So the head of the Jason study, when a great scientist named Gordon MacDonald, when he is interviewed years later for an internal historical project at the American Academy of Physics, what he says is that Carter was a disaster. So Carter could have.
In terms of the Manhattan Project and thinking about the government having a solution to this problem, is one of the challenges we have today a product of the Reagan era, which was that government can't solve any problems, that all of this has to go to the private sector. Are we kind of stuck in private sector thinking at this point?
Do you remember Reagan's famous joke about government? The scariest sentence in the English language is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So yeah, he was able to institute that thinking. Yeah, obviously private sector thinking did not take us to the moon. It did not defeat the Axis powers. There are certain problems. It's really interesting if you think about the history, our problem-solving history as Americans. I've always thought that one reason that the tax rate on extreme wealth from the end of the war until the breakup of the New Deal coalition, the reason why it was in the low 90s, mid 90s, every dollar over $1 million, you were taxed at 90%. The reason why is that the people who, the men and women who fought World War II, they had seen that however much we properly admire entrepreneurs, innovators, when there is a certain kind of a problem, whether it is a war problem or a large environmental problem, that the private sector, however powerful it is, that can't solve it. The only thing that can solve it is the massed will of a nation. And so they remembered that, and then people who don't like that, they try to make us forget. So we are in, quite right, we are in the world that Ronald Reagan built, where we try to solve problems through private industry, which benefits the people who helped bring Ronald Reagan to office.
You know, we need to take a quick commercial break, but I want to continue this conversation. We're going to be right back. Now let's get back to the conversation with David Lipsky about his book, The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial. You know, David, a lot of people don't recognize that the National Academies of Science, that the paragon of government thinking and collaboration, was created by Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, of course. But Republicans have been on the wrong side of this argument a great deal during the past 50 years. And the one that I want to ask you about, the one I don't think people truly understand their role, is John Sununu, who was chief of staff for George H.W. Bush. How did he almost single-handedly derail what was shaping up to be even a Republican embrace of climate science?
It's a great story, and it was a fun one. It was a funny, disturbing one to tell. In writing it, I had to take a break after writing that section, because it's like if you're watching a movie and a character that you love, or if you're watching Mad Men, the show, and Mad Men, the show, as opposed to Mad Men, the musical or the film. But if you're watching the show and a character that you love dies, you have to not watch it for a few weeks. And the issue, even with President Carter not acting, the issue was moving on a sensible schedule. Everybody from the 50s had said this will start manifesting by the late 80s. And in June of 1988, our second great American climate scientist, Dr. James Hansen, who works for NASA at an office near Columbia University, he, on the hottest day of the year in Dirksen 357, super hot hearing room, you can see, there's video of it, you can see everybody fanning their faces and their.
I love the fact that you included the story that they left the windows open to heat the room.
Yeah, that was President Reagan, who had a Hollywood background, had told everybody how important a certain kind of VFX were for getting across your political points. So the senators who were helping Dr. Hansen get his message across, they had their staff go in and open the windows so that the air conditioner would be laboring. Now, the politics on this issue are so wild that the senator later on tried to say we didn't exactly do that, because of course the Republicans jumped on it to say, see, they've always been. The politics on this, there's been an amazing ingenuity applied to the politics and the messaging. And if only we could have applied it to solving this, even down to people in the Department of Energy, even by 1980, when President Reagan came in, what they would say is, if anything has been meeting to death, it's carbon dioxide. If meetings could solve problems, this would be solved by now. So a huge amount of activity. The reports are saying it will be clear by later in this decade. All of the official organs of temperature are saying every decade has been warmer than the one before. And so a man named Tom Wigley, who is doing the measurement for England, he is in the New York Times, I think in 87, saying we've already had the warmest years in recorded history. It will be, if this continues into the 90s, 30 years ago, it will be very difficult to deny climate change. And then he adds, it's difficult to deny it now. So Dr. James Hansen is invited to speak to Congress, and he declares in June of 1988, an election year, that the signature of global warming has been detected, and it is changing the climate now. Now, this is on a reasonable schedule still. President Bush, who called himself the environmentalist president, he picks this as his issue. It isn't an accident. Like, he is running during the summer when this makes the cover of Time and Newsweek.
Yep.
So that's when political issue comes of age, when it gets its first starring role as an issue, and your first starring role is to appear on both covers. So he welcomes the UN group, the IPCC. He is the first president to address them, and his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, was probably the most influential Secretary of State, but the most influential guy,
Mhm.
non-presidential guy in history. He led both Presidents Bush, but he also just was a de facto or a quiet leader of the Republican Party and a very sensible person.
And came from the oil industry.
Exactly, but the oil industry would know. Yes, he's a Houston guy and has that wonderful soft Houston accent, which sounds like leather and the club room, right? But he understands the science because he was, even though Reagan was not going to act on this issue, he has been reading the science for 8 years, and so he welcomes the IPCC and says, "I don't want to get transcendental, but recognition of the problem is the first step to solution. Godspeed." And so the head of the EPA says this was an important message that was delivered and heard, that there are real priorities. Adults are back on this issue. And John Sununu, was chief of staff for George Bush. And he felt that he believed that he was the smartest person in any room. So a longtime Republican strategist, Ed Rollins, said that Sununu was walking proof that you should never tell children their IQ scores. But Sununu felt that he understood this better than anybody else. And so anytime this issue came to a head, he would step in and stop the president from taking policy or even delivering a speech. So that I think in the spring of 90, President Bush was going to become the first US leader, one of the first world leaders to announce specific goals and cuts.
Yeah.
This had been approved by the Secretary of State, by President Baker. It had been approved by the Secretary of Energy. He was going to deliver it, and Sununu got a hold of it, tore it up, and wrote a new speech that advocated more research. And the head of EPA, the chief administrator of EPA, he also said when he was on the Sunday shows, he said, "I'm not going to let," God, people were so deviously good at messaging after 1979 and 80. He said, "I'm not going to let a number of faceless bureaucrats determine policy." Now, he could have said world-renowned scientist, but all the EPA people were wearing lapel buttons that said faceless bureaucrats support action on climate. But had Sununu gotten a hold of the issue, but it was in the Times also. None of this history is secret. The Times said that all these professionals, including Jim Baker, had backed off once they saw John Sununu's ferocity on the topic.
I was struck throughout the book by the misapplication and willful disregard of the precautionary principle, the idea that we shouldn't do something until we understand how it's going to impact things. The deniers would never apply that action to their position, but they demanded, as Sununu did, that you apply it to the position of taking precautions. How should we approach thinking about innovation and policymaking based on what you learned about the way that messaging now shapes what should be scientific decisions?
I'm sorry, that was such a brilliant way to phrase it, that my usual speed in thinking about this is taken off with what a lovely encapsulation. I don't know. Here's the interesting thing, and this is something that I have been noticing since 2015, by which time you could argue that the deniers were routed. They were like, do you ever see one of those like Jason or Freddy Krueger movies where let's say the movie is 100 minutes, at minute 90, Freddy or Jason seems to be dead and they're lying there, and then you look away for a second and then he springs back up for one more spectacular attempt, and then you put him down until the next sequel. That's what happened with the deniers. The deniers seemed like they were dead. They themselves understood that they were kind of dead after 2007. Because the world scientific community had said unequivocally, they used the word unequivocal. That's not my adding the word. They were careful to use the word unequivocally. This is a problem that we're creating. There's no more doubt left. And so when they had their annual meeting, they said both to the New York Times and to the UK Guardian that this was almost a dead cause. They sprang back for one final assault over a thing called ClimateGate, which was terrifying fun to research and write about, and a horrible story, a horrible social media story. But by 2015, they were routed. And here's the weird thing. The weird thing is that by that point, the precautionary principle that they had wanted put into effect in the 90s had become our de facto way of dealing with this. So when it was clear what I keep using climate change itself is a product of the kind of messaging that you and
Yeah.
I have been joking about. The word global warming was replaced in our daily conversation through the Merlin-like prestidigitation of a Republican pollster named Frank Luntz. He just said global warming has catastrophic connotations connected with it. But climate change sounds like you've gone from Ohio to Fort Lauderdale for vacation. So let's start using climate change. And now our mouths, as if still loyal to Frank Luntz, our mouths still want to say that. Anyway, so when it was clear that global warming was the issue it was going to be by the mid-90s, a professor at the MIT School of Business, I think it's the Sloan School, he said, again, this has always been public. He said to Time Magazine, look, it's going to be really difficult. If you wanted to come up with a problem that human institutions aren't designed to deal with, you couldn't pick a better one. You couldn't create a better one than global warming. So after the years of not being able to deal with it, and that is so basically true that Yale, which is where Gus Speth went after he was removed from the Council on Environmental Quality, Yale started a program called the Yale School of Climate Communication because they felt that the real problem is that you can't explain how this works. I don't think that's the problem, but they were trying to figure out why there's been no action. And their leader, 2012, says the exact same thing that the professor at the MIT Business School said, which is it's a problem that our brains are almost wired not to be able to deal with. So the only progress in those 20 years was saying the same thing. Anyway, the basic thing is that the conservatives wanted us to make a cost-benefit analysis, which is, and people didn't want to do this in the first 30 years. But the Parrot side of the rhetoric on this always made it seem like destabilizing changes from climate if we don't act today, right around the corner. And the average voter noticed that the sun still rose and the water still flowed. And so by now, what's happened with voters and just people, because they're only voters once every 2 years, I think what they've understood is they're making the cost-benefit analysis, which is they've told us it's a problem for 30 years, 40 years. We haven't done anything. Things are really bad in the summer, but the deal we get from fossil fuel is so good that we're accepting it. So the precautionary principle, because of the genius of these idea marketers, has worked its way down into everyone's bones on this particular topic.
I am sure that there's a special place in hell for Frank Luntz, you mentioned earlier, for weaponizing information on behalf of climate destroying businesses and cigarettes and everything else he's done. Although he's doing this weird.
Yeah, he's tried to come back now.
He's trying to come back as a moderate, which is frightening.
Weirdly, though, it's so strong. Just to say, like, the other way of looking at the Frank Luntz story is that the evidence, anybody who is still saying that the science on this is unclear. Frank Luntz, who was the strongest, the best soldier, he was the Achilles. He was the Brad Pitt playing Achilles on this topic. He said, yeah, I was wrong about the issue. I now understand how the physics works. Anyway, yes, so you were
so how did the denial industry sucker so many journalists into playing along with the, well, we've got to do some more research story? And I believe that the Parrot's narrative is a product of the tendency to sensationalize headlines more than anything else. Do you have hope that we have a communications system?
Yeah. Okay. So
American democracy that will work.
I would say the reporting on this. There's a few ways to look at it, but the basic thing is the reporting on this is incredibly solid. Like we are, our media likes to flagellate itself. That is one of its hobbies. And often there's good reason. But this is a case where if you are in the media, you can hold your head high because Time Magazine is reporting on this in the 50s. In 1933, this is how far back this issue goes. It's on the cover of the New York Times. And this is, again, how old this issue is in our reporting culture. Above the fold, on the left side of the newspaper, we're going to try to end Al Capone's speakeasies. On the right side of the newspaper, Germans promised to end attacks on Jews in the Reich. And then between it is a story about the fact that the world is heating up in a way that we can't account for. So the news has been great on this. Here's the thing that I think is that The deniers gave us a way to blame some obvious malefactors. We could say we would like to stop having the wonderful benefits. Like fossil fuels have been an amazing deal for our species, a huge deal. I'm talking to you through a pane of glass.
Mhm.
Shocking, right? Impossible without fossil fuels. So we could keep enjoying them, and we could also say the reason that we haven't moved beyond them, or the reason we haven't taken painful action on this issue, is because of those 24 denying scientists over there. They performed a valuable service, so that for 30 years, we could say, we're fine, we're good-hearted people. It's because of those guys. And what I think is fascinating about us as a people is that since they were routed, and by the middle of the last decade, they are routed, what we have to accept is that we don't seem to want to do anything on this issue. And that is a fascinating thing.
It's the political will. The collective will of the country is not in any sense aligned at this point, and that's the crisis that I think that we currently need to confront and
Yeah,
will.
but I think that again, like we have all, like the deniers did us a great, like they did us dirty by delaying action, but they
Yeah.
did us a great service because we could think well of ourselves and think
Mhm.
poorly of our adversaries because they had hired the deniers. They haven't been here for 10 years. And
Yeah.
2018, the IPCC, which is the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, even the UN accepted Frank Luntz. He's the most influential writer of our time. Even the governing body of this science uses Frank Luntz language. But in 2018, international headlines, we have to cut our emissions
Yeah.
by 45% between
Yeah.
2018 and 2030, or we're going to be committed to warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we have 12 years as of 2018. Everybody gets that sober look on their face and the sober sound in their voice. We are halfway through the time limit that was set for us by the world scientists. How do you think we've done on cutting the 45% of our emissions?
Oh, not at all.
We are 4% up. Last
Yeah.
year, 2023 was the largest release of emissions in history. I think it's not about voting. It's not about will. I think people accurately see that no government is taking this seriously. They saw how
Mhm.
quickly people responded to the threat of COVID. Within 2 to 3 weeks, people were quarantining. They
Yeah.
saw how they have responded to violent warfare type threats. And however much people talk about this, they also see that there is never action taken. And so they have begun to wonder properly whether this is a serious issue.
Well, I think, I do believe that the thinking on this has changed profoundly, and there is some action that is meaningful. I was on a call with Kim Stanley Robinson, the author of Ministry for the Future of the Future, a couple of months ago. And he said, I'm stunned. I did not think when I was writing this book in 2019 that we would be where we are in terms of progress today in 2024. And that was, at least for me, a reflection of a hopeful perspective. And I wanted to ask you, because you wrote that through the process of writing the book, that you became what you described as an unpleasant person.
Yeah.
It's two questions. Was it worth it to become the unpleasant person? Do you see a change in the debate as a result, or are you still feeling unpleasant?
My friends say that I've become more pleasant since I've stopped working on the book. And they were, no, it's a little bit like, do you know climate scientists socially? Do you know any of them socially? You must have come
A
across
few,
them.
but I live so far from anywhere that I don't hang
Got
out.
it. Yeah, you live near one of the great heroes of the denial movement, Professor. You live near Robinson, who
Mhm.
struck the greatest blow on behalf of denial that was ever struck. But the look that they have is not that it's not that false look of like we need to do something, but we know that we don't care about this issue that much or it would have acted. The look that they have is the wry smile, the always December but never Christmas smile. So that and there's been a huge debate in their community about how honest should we be.
Mhm.
If we say this is really bad, people will feel they can't do anything. So if we say there is hope, even if it's not looking great, maybe people will feel that they can make more progress. I always think I have a number of friends who went through recovery, and in recovery, it's a simple thing. You touch bottom, you recognize you touch bottom. And as long as people think, we have tried the other approach of saying there's good news, we're doing great work for 40 years on this issue, and nothing has been done. So yes, there is, President Biden is the only president who's taken effective action on this issue in all the presidents that we've had since 79. And there is a lot of money being put into the private sector to create the gadget. But what the scientists always thought, and what Al Gore said, so 2007, the scientists come back and they say this is unequivocal. And 2007 is the same year that President or former Vice President Gore receives his Nobel, and he also receives a cultural Nobel. His documentary is a hit, and he wins an Academy Award. So he is doubly Nobeled. And when he goes to Davos, that's your triple Nobel when you're invited to Davos. What he looks at is that the action that we've taken with all the political momentum that's been built. I don't know if you remember, some of our listeners will remember, we decide to outlaw Thomas Edison's incandescent light bulb. And so what he said is, it's about changing laws, not light bulbs. And what he understood is that this is not a private, it's not a changing your consumption patterns. And it's not about people building a gadget, although it'd be wonderful if the gadget solves it. It is actually about passing laws in the same way that we could quarantine during COVID, and that we passed actual laws that meant we are at war with the Axis powers. So I am less enthusiastic when the solution lies with private industry. I guess I still don't trust President Reagan that much.
Well, you brought up recovery, and the fourth step in recovery is to take a fearless moral inventory. And
yes,
it doesn't
exactly.
seem like we have done that as a society. It seems like we are continuing to discuss whether or not we should take an inventory. And I thought your book really helped lay that story out in a way that people can digest and internalize, to think about the denial they still continue to hear, because I hear it from my neighbors.
So you have neighbors, I really appreciate you saying that, but you have neighbors who will still say, this isn't happening?
To various degrees, not blanket
Degree is a great word to use, because after the last couple of summers, and this is one of the things the scientists were waiting for, was it's been proved on the equations, right? And then it's been proved because we are seeing the parts per million increase the way it's supposed to increase. We are seeing changes in the jet stream, and we are seeing greater frequency of above 90-degree and 100-degree days. But what they had always assumed was that if you had a disastrous summer season, that it would lead to actual changes on this issue. And the way that they have a particular index for this, which I'll talk about in a second, but they expected there to be change. And by the end of last summer, when Gallup was polling people like your neighbors, there'd been, I think the number had gone up about 28%. 25 or 28% of people who said that climate had changed in the last 5 years, 70% of Americans. So that's why I smiled when you said about degrees. Pretty much everybody accepts that the climate has been changed. And so, yeah.
There was the one that struck me was Texans in 2020, 1 in 4 said climate change was real. Then the winter disaster happened, and 3 in 4 said it was real.
That's right. Yeah.
But I mean, I live in rural mountainous Oregon where whole communities have burned, and there's still the discussion as to whether or not it could really happen here.
I think that what they're saying is that they don't necessarily, they are doing, as citizens, they're doing cost-benefit analyses that that the Republicans wanted us to do on this issue. And what they've decided is, we're still going to roll the dice. There may be a gadget, and this deal is too good. But the scientists who believe in science, what Dr. Hansen has always advocated, and he's advocated it in a series of op-eds. He's published them in the Wall Street Journal, in the LA Times, and the New York Times, is that there is a solution. There's a solution that, and this was a thoroughly understood issue from its second birth in the 1950s, thoroughly understood. And by 1961, the Times said that it was the primary concern for climatologists. And that era was, I'm going to use Lentz's word again, climate change. And then Time magazine in the same period said, here's a great thing about nuclear power. it will not continue to release carbon dioxide. So the scientists have always understood that if we begin talking seriously about using nuclear power, then it will mean that we are deciding to solve the issue. And if we're not talking about that, what they understand is that we are still substituting the pleasure of talking about something for the hard roll up the sleeves reality of making choices and making changes.
Well put. So I want to ask, what's next? Is there more to the climate story that you want to write about, or have you found another topic to make yourself miserable?
There are other topics that actually make me happy now, but what's next is just like, this is a great story that we're living. I am curious how it's going to play out. So I am still fascinated by this. I'm curious how you think it's going to play out, because to me, if we know how long this issue has existed, if we know how solid the science is, and also if we stopped using it, at the moment, the blue, we play for Team Blue. At the moment, Team Blue doesn't, it's a great deal that we get. We can use this issue as a way to hit with the heavy books on this issue. We can use the heavy books to hit the heads of the people on Team Red without having to sacrifice or without having to invest in anything. And I think that as we recognize that, this has just become part of the larger binary struggle, the Parrot versus Igloo struggle. I think when we say, hey, actually, we all live under the same weather, and we all have to decide, okay, here's what we're willing to give up, here's what we're willing to do, or we're going to invest in 30 new expensive nuclear plants. But I actually think that the exciting part of the story is ahead. And so for me, my job was just to tell the exciting first half of the story that we've lived through already.
Sure seems to me like it all depends not on Team Red or Blue, but on Team Purple that emerges in the middle.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that with the tech sector, which I know that you've been a part of, has understood and has been impatient with that. I think the tech sector gets places that we all get to. Sometimes a little of the vaporware becomes the actual portable computer we can hold in our hands and put in our pockets. And I think that purple thinking from Silicon Valley and its various satellites around the West Coast, I think we're moving towards that now. I think that we're moving towards beyond seeing this as a cricket bat that one side can use against the other. I think we're understanding that that just makes half the country deny the evidence of their senses. So that is the exciting part of the story.
Yeah. And that new middle that emerges around the idea that we have to make some compromises, because many environmentalists are just so anti-nuclear that they can't embrace the idea that that could be part of a solution. In terms of the Silicon Valley progress that I see, I wrote a book about the Apple Newton in 1993 and declared that we would become digital nomads. It took another 15 years for the iPhone to come out, which was the first really transformative mobile device.
Newton too.
Steve would never have said that. But
he thought it was bad luck, but he would have.
Well, no, it was John Scully's device.
Yeah.
And but I mean, when we think about all of the things that you said about the dialogue has been going on, we were on a plan. There's always that one person who can derail the process that is underway. And I do see the potential for that in the election. And that worries me.
Yeah, although the weird thing about, so for the climate scientists, their feeling about politics changed after the later part of the first decade of the century. Because what they had understood was that once Team Red was out and Team Blue came back in, and if Team Blue came back in when the science had been digested, it had been presented, it had been vetted, and it had then been digested, that there would be action. And when there wasn't action, they began to understand that it was part of this larger fight, that they're the thing that they devoted their lives to, and that they had been saying, hey, this is quite serious. Like a guy named Dr. Richard Alley, one of the great climatologists of this period. He plays on at the same level as Dr. Hansen. What he said at the press conference for the release of the 2007 IPCC, the report 4, he said, we've done good science. We have faith in the science. This is real. This is real. This is real. Now act. The ball's back in your court. Heartbreaking and stirring. Every time I say it, I'm stirred by his belief that there would be action from February on. And when action didn't come from Team Blue, they understood that it was a more complicated game than they thought.
I think if people understand that the other bogey being raised in this election, which is immigration, is deeply related to the climate crisis, that might be the thing that turns Team Purple on.
I'm laughing because you know from the book that one of the Europeans, and this is just how the Europeans, this is awful to say, but they weaponized racism for good.
Hmm.
One of the reasons why they were able to take action on this more quickly than we were, although they have run out of gas to some degree on it too, is they would say they would say this to researchers, and that's something they would say, obviously, if they were being interviewed on MSNBC. They would say to people who doubted whether we had to take action, okay, my friend, you are a conservative, you don't want to take action, but the low-lying regions where there will be sea level rise, those are people that I understand from the way you're talking that you don't like, and it will bring many more of them into Germany. Is I always assumed is the first place this kind of argument would be made. I'm still going back to that 1933 headline.
Yeah.
But you could then convince people that if they have this racist dislike of changing demographics in their countries, that the best way to fend that off is by making sure the climate is good all around the world. So yes, that was a strategy. I don't want to say weaponized, but it was essentialized or usicized by the Europeans as of the 90s.
Well, I mean, the book that has struck me is seeing this pretty clearly, that is not getting a lot of attention, is America's New Map by Thomas P.M. Barnett. He did the Pentagon's new map about 25 years ago, which changed American defense policy pretty dramatically. But his argument is that if the United States leads the response to the climate crisis, it can reassert its global dominance and prevent the kind of inbound immigration that people are worried to death over. And unfortunately, that level of dialogue hasn't reached the individual who is trying to consume information about both the election, which is its own bizarre alt world, and climate, and in which we actually live and are experiencing the rising temperatures. Because the other thing about neighbors, all of them acknowledge it's a lot hotter than it was, and that we have more extreme weather.
Yeah, but what they're saying is that they still like the deal. There's
Yeah.
a point will come. The problem is at the point that you don't want the deal, it will be too late to reverse. The reason I was
Exactly.
smiling when you mentioned the thing from America's New Map is that when I say that to people who don't know the long history of this issue, they look at me in a funny way.
Yeah.
But of course, like that is America has traditionally led with innovation, and it's led by example. And so you could argue, by the way, that President Biden putting out the many trillions of dollars is an attempt to begin doing that. But yes, that is America. There was a moment under the second President Bush when the Europeans literally said, we are waiting for America to resume its usual leading role. And that we have lagged on this issue, and we've lagged on it politically, but also technologically. So that's lovely to hear that book exists. I didn't know about that book.
Well, David, thank you for articulating the history in a way that I found really engaging, and I hope everybody takes the time to read the book. And thank you for your time.
Oh, no, Mitchell, it was a great conversation. Thank you for the time, and thanks for liking the book so much.
That was my conversation with David Lipsky, author of The Parrot and the Igloo, a book that lays out the circuitous path that we followed from the scientific discovery of the threat of global warming from rising atmospheric CO2 levels through a 60-year era of growing acceptance of the reality of global warming, despite concerted misinformation campaigns by fossil fuel companies and their political allies. The Parrot and the Igloo is available at Amazon and Powell Books online, as well as in your local bookstore. I hope you take the time to read it. It really is an entertaining and informative read. There's not a great deal to add to the conversation with David, but how about this? The deal that he described, that Americans and many in the global north who have benefited most from the fossil fuels age are not willing to give up. The one that traded a healthy, vibrant future for an age of warming and disruption is typically seen through the lens of loss. We're not going to be able to drive wherever we want. We won't have plastic and first-class airfares. Well, if you look at all that will change as a result only from the perspective of loss, the fossil fuels deal does look pretty hard to toss aside. But keep in mind that each time humanity has adopted a new primary energy source, as we can now with renewable energy and potentially even nuclear energy, there has been an eruption of opportunity and prosperity. The sustainable low carbon economy can and will be better than what we fear losing. It'll be cleaner, healthier, and more economically and geographically mobile than the oil age. So, when you discuss the changes we need to make to cool the planet and restore nature with your friends, consider taking the tack of offering what the New Deal could look like and how it might produce progress and the benefits that each of us are looking for in our lives and for our grandchildren's lives. Don't just tell people what they must give up. Now that climate misinformation is on the run, it's time to propose and deliver on a better future. I hope you take a moment to share this podcast or any of the more than 480 interviews that we produced on sustainability in your ear with your friends, your family, your coworkers. Folks, take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform. It will help your neighbors find us because you are the amplifier that can spread more ideas so we create less waste. Please tell your friends and family that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness they may prefer. Thank you for your support. And by the way, we will make every effort to try to paint a picture of that future and how we can get to a better outcome than the one that we are currently headed for. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.